That evening felt ordinary on the surface as I sat down at the dinner table, believing it would be another quiet family meal, never suspecting it would become the night that quietly erased me from my own family. My name is Sienna. I am 34 years old, and I walked into that house believing that as long as I stayed calm, stayed respectful, stayed small enough, I would always have a place sitting among them. I took my seat without fear, without suspicion, while the air around the table felt unusually tight because no one spoke freely. No one looked directly at me, and everyone moved as if they were preparing for something they did not want to explain out loud. My father sat across from me, his face controlled, his posture rigid, his eyes cold in the way they always get, when image matters more to him than honesty. And when the room finally went quiet, he looked straight at me and said, "Don't come for Christmas. You're no longer part of this family." The silence that followed felt heavy. But what broke me was not his words. It was the reaction around me. My brother tightened his jaw, looked down at his plate, and nodded once without lifting his head. His wife sat completely still, her lips pressed together. Her hands folded, her eyes, refusing to meet mine. That was the moment I understood everything. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not beg. I smiled quietly, and in my head, a decision was already made. I booked a luxury cruise. I invited every relative who had ever been pushed aside. I even invited his neighbors. When I later posted photos from the deck, the calls would not stop coming. Before I continue, like this video, subscribe to the channel and tell me where you are watching from. If you have ever felt pushed out by your own family, share your story below. Growing up in that coastal house, I slowly learned how silence worked inside my family. From the outside, everything looked normal. We had routines, shared meals, familiar faces at the table, and a structure that made us look like a stable home. Inside that structure, I was always the one standing in the quiet spaces, filling in what no one else wanted to mention, smoothing out tension before it turned into something people had to face. I was never the one asked when real decisions were being made, but I was always the one people called when something felt uncomfortable. When tempers rose, I stepped in. When conversations became fragile, I softened them. When things felt like they were about to break, I absorbed the pressure so others could breathe easier. My brother Nathan Blake moved through that house with an ease that came naturally to him. He sat close to Dad during important moments, spoke only when necessary, and when he did, people listened without resistance. In difficult situations, his loyalty always landed in the same place. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently, and without hesitation. There were never loud arguments between Nathan and me. There was no shouting, no open conflict, no dramatic scenes. What existed instead was distance, quiet, and steady growing over time through all the moments when he chose not to look at me, not to ask, not to notice. After Mom passed away, the house did not fall apart overnight. It became quieter in a way that felt deeper than noise, like something essential had been removed and never replaced. Conversations became shorter. Warmth disappeared slowly. The air between us felt heavier, though no one spoke about it directly. I tried to keep things steady, not because anyone asked me to, but because I did not want to watch the family drift further apart. I learned to listen more than I spoke. I learned to step back before conflict could bloom. I learned to prioritize peace over being understood. The more I tried, the clearer it became that I lived at the edges of everything. I was present. I was reliable. I was there, but I was never treated as part of the center. Decisions were made without me. Changes happened without my voice. My presence was expected, but my thoughts were optional. Over time, I understood something that was difficult to admit. My role was not to be protected or heard. My role was to make everything look stable from the outside, even when inside I had already started to feel empty, long before anyone noticed. 2 weeks before Christmas, something in the house felt different to me. Not louder or colder, but sharper in a way that made small details impossible to ignore. Once I finally saw them, I began watching how people were treated when they spoke, who was listened to, who was dismissed without words, who was tolerated instead of respected, and who Dad decided deserved real attention. That was when I started paying attention to my Aunt Lorraine Blake. Lorraine was not loud, not dramatic, not someone who demanded space, but she was always careful with her words, careful with her posture, careful with where she stood when she visited. I saw how she paused before speaking, as if she needed permission that was never formally given. When she offered ideas, Dad would nod without really looking at her, then change the subject as if her voice was background noise instead of someone who had lived inside this family her entire life. A few days later, I noticed the same pattern with my uncle Dennis Blake. Dennis was quiet in a different way, more restrained than fragile, like someone who learned early that speaking too much came with consequences. He helped when he was asked, but was never invited into real discussions. He stood near door frames, leaned against counters, watched conversations instead of leading them. When Dad spoke, Dennis went silent in a way that felt automatic, not respectful. What disturbed me was how consistent it all looked once I stopped protecting the image in my own head. Lorraine and Dennis were not treated as equal parts of the family structure. They were treated like afterthoughts who were expected to show up, smile, agree, and then step back without complaint. Dad never had to raise his voice to control them. He used silence instead. Long pauses, firm looks, brief dismissals that landed harder than shouting. I started seeing how that control worked on everyone, not just them. The room adjusted itself around his moods. Conversations shifted mid-sentence. People laughed softer. Chairs moved slightly back. It was not chaos. It was order built on fear of being seen as unnecessary. Nathan followed that rhythm perfectly. He did not question. He mirrored. He approved. I realized something in that period that I had never said out loud before. I was not only one being pushed away from the center. I had just been too focused on trying to earn my place to recognize the pattern that had already existed long before me. Lorraine was tolerated. Dennis was sidelined. And I was slowly learning to disappear in the quietest way possible. That realization did not fill me with rage. It filled me with clarity. I began to imagine something different without trying to force it into reality. Yet I thought about what it would look like if the people who were usually ignored were allowed to choose their own space instead of waiting to be included. I thought about what freedom would feel like if respect was not tied to approval. The idea of creating something separate started forming slowly, not as a plan, not as revenge, but as a private thought I kept to myself. I did not tell Lorraine. I did not tell Dennis. I did not confront Dad. I simply watched more closely, listened more carefully, and let the thoughts sit quietly in my mind while the weeks moved closer to Christmas. 1 week later, the Christmas dinner carried a pressure that no one said out loud. Yet, everyone felt through stiff movements, forced pauses, and the careful way words were chosen around the table. That night, I walked into the dining room with a strange heaviness settling in my chest because the room no longer felt like a family space, but more like a stage where everyone had memorized their positions, their expressions, and the version of themselves. They needed to present to important people who were not even there yet. The family was preparing to host guests with strong reputations in the community. People whose opinions carried weight, people who could lift or damage the name my father cared about, with a single comment which made the atmosphere tighter with every passing minute, as if the air itself was watching for mistakes. My father barely spoke, yet his worry was visible in the small details of his behavior, including the way he kept adjusting his sleeves, tightening his jaw, and scanning every face around the table, not with care, but with control, checking that no one looked weak, unsure, or out of place in the image he had been protecting for years. Halfway through the meal, his eyes stopped on me, staying there longer than felt natural, not as a passing glance, but as a deliberate pause, as if he had been rehearsing the words in his head for a long time, and had finally chosen the exact moment to release them. He straightened his posture, lifted his chin slightly, and spoke without any effort to soften the sentence, because in that moment, reputation mattered more to him than my existence. Don't come for Christmas. You're out of this family. The sentence was not shouted, and it was not fueled by visible anger, which somehow made it feel more final because it sounded like a decision he had already signed somewhere in his mind long before that night, as if I had only been waiting for the official announcement. The room became intentionally silent after that. Not an awkward silence, but a silence that felt prepared, shared, and accepted by everyone sitting there. No one asked him to repeat himself. No one questioned him. No one tried to interrupt what had clearly been planned in spirit, if not in words. Nathan did not speak, and his face showed no discomfort. His expression stayed firm, his lips pressing lightly together, and his gaze lowered just enough to avoid meeting my eyes. Not because he was ashamed, but because he was quietly agreeing without needing to say anything that would expose his position. Sitting beside him was my sister-in-law Courtney, who remained completely quiet from the beginning to the end of that moment. Her hands rested neatly on her lap. Her posture stayed straight and her eyes remained fixed on the table, choosing silence as the safest way to stay untouched by the consequences of that sentence. In that moment, what I felt was not shock, and it was not the kind of pain I had imagined in my head during quiet nights when I questioned my place in this family, but something calmer and colder, like the quiet understanding of a truth I had always sensed, but never allowed myself to name. I did not argue because I knew explanations would not matter. I did not beg because I understood it would only make me smaller in their eyes. I smiled. That smile was not weak, and it was not fake, but steady and clear, coming from a strange sense of relief, because being pushed out so openly freed me from the exhausting effort of trying to earn a place that was never mine to begin with. I slowly pushed my chair back so the sound would carry through the room that had become too quiet, stood up without asking permission, and turned away from the table while everyone else remained still, like figures frozen in a scene they had rehearsed too well to break. Each step away from that table felt steadier than the last. Because the farther I moved from that room, the lighter my chest became, as if I had been carrying a weight for years, without realizing it, until it was finally lifted without warning. That night ended without shouting, without chaos, and without dramatic scenes. But inside me, a quiet decision started to take shape. Not fueled by anger and not built from revenge, but from a calm realization that my story no longer had to be written inside a house where I was only allowed to exist in silence. 3 days later, I acted on a thought I had kept quietly inside me. I sat alone in my apartment with a strange kind of calm that only comes when a person finally stops asking for permission to exist. For the first time in my life, I did not call anyone from my family to ask what they thought because I already knew what they would say, and because their approval no longer had any real value to me. I opened my laptop and chose a luxury cruise line without hesitation, not as an act of revenge, but as a declaration that my life could expand beyond the narrow room where I had been forced to sit for years. I paid for the entire reservation with my own savings, fully aware of every dollar I was spending and fully comfortable with the choice because I wanted this decision to be clean, independent, and untouched by their influence. No one helped me, no one advised me, and no one even knew it was happening, which made the action feel stronger and more honest than anything I had ever done before. That same evening, I reached out to my Aunt Lorraine, who had spent most family gatherings sitting quietly at the edges of conversations, offering smiles that were rarely returned and opinions that were rarely taken seriously. When I spoke to her, I did not explain everything in detail, and I did not ask for permission. I simply told her that I wanted her to be part of something that was being built with respect instead of judgment. Lorraine went quiet on the phone, not in confusion, but in the kind of silence that happens when someone feels seen after a very long time. Shortly after that, I contacted my Uncle Dennis, who had always been present physically, but never truly included in the larger decisions that shaped the family's public image. I told him that I was organizing a private holiday experience and that I wanted him there because his presence mattered to me. Dennis did not laugh, did not question my intentions, and did not hesitate, which made me realize how rarely anyone had simply invited him without conditions. Once those invitations were made, something in me became clearer, and I started thinking about the wider circle of relatives who had slowly disappeared from the inner family structure without any formal conflict. I sent messages to cousins, distant aunts, and older relatives who had been quietly pushed to the background over the years. I did not describe the cruise as a luxury experience, and I did not use it as a way to impress anyone. I presented it as a space where no one would be made to feel small. And that tone changed everything. I then made a choice that I knew would create whispers if the truth ever came out. I invited Howard Wilcox and Sandra Wilcox, my father's longtime neighbors, who had watched the family from close enough to understand the surface story, but far enough to never see what happened inside. I told them clearly that this was not gossip, not a statement, and not a performance, but a personal decision to surround myself with people who valued calm loyalty over reputation. Howard reacted with surprise while Sandra sounded genuinely touched, which confirmed that my instinct was right. Throughout all of these preparations, I made sure that nothing reached my father. There were no shared calendars, no visible transactions, no conversations that could be repeated. I kept everything quiet because this was not about provoking a reaction. It was about building a separate world that did not depend on his approval or control. The silence was not heavy, and it did not feel like secrecy. It felt like ownership. Every detail was arranged without conflict, without announcements, and without the need to justify myself. I chose departure dates, coordinated travel details, and confirmed reservations during late evenings when the world outside felt distant. I did not feel anger while doing these things, and I did not feel fear. I felt steady, grounded, and strangely grateful that I no longer had to explain my worth to anyone sitting around that old dining table. By the time everything was confirmed, I did not feel like someone running away from a family. I felt like someone who had finally learned how to choose her own space without asking to be allowed inside. By the time the ship left the harbor, the story stopped being private. I posted the first photo from the deck without hesitation, not as a statement and not as a weapon, but as a quiet confirmation that I was no longer hiding or shrinking to fit inside a space that had never protected me. My hands felt steady while uploading it because this time I was not asking for permission. I was simply letting the world see the version of my life that had been invisible for far too long. Lorraine stood beside me in the picture, not posing, not smiling for attention, just existing calmly in a way that felt honest and strong. Dennis was there as well, close enough to feel safe, far enough to feel independent, and I noticed how natural it looked to have people near me who were never afraid to be seen. I did not add dramatic captions and I did not explain anything in detail because the image said everything I needed without a single word. The first reactions appeared quietly with distant relatives sending private messages asking simple questions that carried far more meaning than they admitted. Some asked why they had not seen me at the official Christmas gathering, while others asked why Lorraine and Dennis were suddenly visible in ways they had never been before. Nobody accused me, but the curiosity traveled faster than direct confrontation ever could, and I felt the weight of it shifting across conversations that I could not see. More pictures followed, not staged and not exaggerated, showing moments of laughter that had never been rehearsed, showing closeness that did not require approval, showing a version of family that was built by choice rather than control. I noticed how quickly those images spread through private conversations, group chats, and whispered exchanges because silence had always been used as a tool in that house. And now silence was filling with questions nobody was ready to answer. Howard and Sandra started hearing about it through people they trusted, not through gossip columns or public rumors, but through simple living room conversations where neighbors speak too freely without realizing how much truth they carry. I did not have to push the story forward, and I did not have to defend myself because the existence of the moment was stronger than any argument I could have made. Within hours, people began to connect the absence of my name from one table with the presence of my face in another space. And it created a tension that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. I could feel it without seeing it because the tone of the messages shifted from curiosity to confusion, then to quiet judgment toward the family name that had always been presented as flawless. I did not say his name during any of this, and I did not send him the photos directly, because he did not deserve the dignity of a personal invitation into a world he had already rejected. What reached him came through others, through sideways looks and whispered remarks, through neighbors asking questions that carried too much truth to ignore, and through small cracks in the public image he had spent years building. I imagined his frustration without needing proof because the pattern was obvious, and once it started it could not be stopped or guided back into neat silence. He lost control without me touching him, and the story moved without my voice pushing it because once truth is seen it no longer belongs to the person who tried to bury it. What affected me the most was not the attention or the reactions but the calmness in my own chest because for the first time I was not reacting to his decisions or to his approval, and I was not shaping my existence around fear of losing a place that had never been stable. That night, the stars felt closer than the old ceilings I had lived under. A week had passed, and the damage could no longer be ignored. I did not need to be present to see the consequences, because the silence from their world spoke louder than any message ever could. It started quietly, but spread through every corner of the community in ways that could not be undone once people began connecting the missing pieces without being told what to think. The moment Dad was removed from the community board did not arrive with a public announcement or a dramatic scene. It arrived through absence. His name stopped appearing in meeting schedules, stopped being mentioned in emails, and eventually stopped being spoken with the respect that had once followed it automatically. I learned about it through people who never spoke to me directly, but spoke around me through shifting tone and hesitant body language whenever the family name was mentioned in conversation. Nathan felt the consequences in a very different way through a door that never opened. A major opportunity, one that had been shaping his future for months, quietly disappeared from the table without a formal rejection or a clear explanation. People who once returned his calls within minutes suddenly found excuses to delay, postpone, and eventually avoid responding at all. That kind of silence is louder than criticism because it leaves no one to argue with and no reputation left to defend. Courtney experienced her loss through social circles that once formed the center of her identity. Invitations stopped arriving. Group chats grew quiet when she spoke. The subtle glances in public spaces shifted from admiration to polite distance that no one could openly label as rejection. She did not fall publicly. She faded socially, which is a cruelty that leaves no visible bruise, but lingers longer than any confrontation would have. Lorraine and Dennis chose distance with a calm certainty that I respected more than any dramatic gesture. After the cruise ended, they did not argue, explain, or confront anyone. They simply stepped away from every space that had once required them to shrink themselves. Their absence was not chaotic. It was clean. I understood that silence can be a boundary when it comes from self-respect rather than fear. Neighbors began to change the way they spoke about the Blake name when they thought no one was listening. Conversations would slow when the topic arose. Compliments became cautious. Respect grew fragile. A reputation built over years can fracture in days, once enough people begin to question the story that supported it. I received messages during that week, many of them long, many of them emotional, most of them desperate in tone. I did not open them. I did not respond. Walking away was not about punishment. It was about refusing to be pulled back into a narrative where my worth depended on permission from people who had already decided I was optional. There is a strange kind of clarity that appears when you stop trying to be understood by people who never intended to listen. My days became quieter. My thoughts became steadier. I stopped checking my phone in the morning. I started waking up without tension sitting in my chest. I did not return home. I did not explain myself. I did not defend my choices. The most powerful decision I made during that time was to stay silent because silence was the only language they had ever used to control me, and now it belonged to me instead. Some decisions change everything. After the cruise ended, I chose not to return to what had already broken. I changed my phone number without ceremony, without conflict, without the need to explain myself to anyone who once believed they had access to me by default. There was no announcement, no warning, no dramatic exit. Only a quiet decision that belonged to me alone. I understood that protecting my peace required distance that could not be negotiated. So, I made that distance real in the most practical way possible. Not long after that, I moved to another part of the same state, choosing a place that felt neutral, unfamiliar, untouched by old expectations or inherited tension. I told no one from my former home where I was going, not out of fear, but out of respect for the boundary I was building. My new address belonged only to me, just as my time, my routine, and my energy finally did. The life I started to build was not glamorous or loud, but it was honest in a way I had never experienced before. I chose my mornings deliberately, shaped my evenings slowly, and created a sense of stability that did not depend on approval or belonging. There were no more silent tests, no more unspoken rules, no more moments where I tried to guess what version of myself would be tolerated that day. I was not performing. I was living. From a distance, I heard what happened to the Blake name. Not through gossip, but through the quiet way people spoke more carefully whenever it was mentioned. Conversations shifted. Tone changed. Invitations stopped arriving. The kind of respect that once protected them slowly thinned as more people began looking at their history through a different lens. I did not feel triumph. I felt clarity. What I witnessed was not revenge. It was consequence. For a long time, I believed that leaving meant I was weak. That walking away meant I was avoiding something I should have endured. Over time, I learned that staying in places that shrink you is not loyalty. And tolerating emotional isolation is not strength. I did not disappear because I was scared. I left because I deserved something more stable than constant justification for my existence. I did not respond to their messages. I did not explain my choices. I did not soften my silence. That silence had been used against me long enough, and at last it worked in my favor. I learned that sometimes closure does not come from conversations or apologies, but from the quiet realization that you survived something that was never built to hold you safely. I did not go back. I did not look back. I did not owe anyone a version of myself that was exhausted from trying. Sometimes the strongest decision is not confrontation, but distance, not arguments, but boundaries, not proving worth, but choosing peace. You do not owe your energy to people who only recognize your value when it benefits them. Walking away does not make you selfish, weak, or dramatic. It makes you honest with yourself. When you choose self-respect over forced belonging, you are not abandoning anyone. You are finally protecting the part of you that matters most. Thank you for spending your time with this story and walking through this emotional journey together. If this story felt real, meaningful, or familiar in any way, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences matter more than you think. Let me know what you would have done in my place. And if leaving would have felt like freedom or loss to you.